everybody, and welcome to this Deconstructing PI Planning Episode 2. Today I have the pleasure of being joined by Mark Richards, Stephan and Yuval Garrett. And this is a continuation of a stream that we started last week, where we wanted to look as a group of SPCTs and very experienced safe practitioners at some of the underlying mechanics and nuance of PI planning. It's, to many people, I think, the defining characteristic of SAFE, at least it has been for a number of years. And yet, despite that, there's a huge opportunity, I think, to look at our practices and our behaviors and the nuance of how we approach it and find better ways, because continuous improvement is, frankly, what we stand for and is the basis of the entire framework in a lot of ways. So a little bit of an opening. I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about contextualization and what it means to contextualize practices from a generic cookbook, a library of patterns and practices as represented by the framework, and the nuance and the details of what exists in a given enterprise or even a given release train, like at the hyperlocal level for SAFE. Who would like to take a first shot at addressing that? Mark and I had a decent background conversation during the week. Do you want to put a couple questions out there to start in on this?
I think for me, it's been the lesson that I've learned the hard way again and again over the entire time with SAFE. In the beginning, I wanted to hyper-contextualize everything. And what I didn't realize was the danger of the way that people would copy a contextualization to a different context. And it was what Dean and the framework team taught me over time was anything they put in the framework that has any kind of nuance, people will take the thing they put in the framework and ignore the nuance. And they've become hyper-aware of the potential misinterpretation of anything they publish in the framework. And it's built, to be brutally honest, it's built a lot more sympathy in me for the decision process they go through, as opposed to my rabid desire to go, context is everything.
I can certainly appreciate that. I would suggest that the work I've done writing in the framework is some of the hardest writing I've ever done in my career because of exactly what you just described. Stephan, anything to add around your experience with contextualization and the journey?
I'm thinking about what is the right flight level, right? When it comes to contextualization. And as Mark just reminded us is, can you take it back to a general context that applies to almost everyone, or general context that you can use? And I guess that's the potential of PI planning, but that's also the danger in PI planning, right? Not doing copy paste, but also being able to base on a good structure, on a good context, and then move on. And that's what drives me. That's what I feel when you just mention contextualization.
For me, I'm thinking about simplicity, maximizing the amount of work not done in the context of framework articles and guidance we provide to people. And it's hard, right? Each one of these articles, every time we provide guidance, especially when it's written without understanding the context of the specific people that will use it, you need to hold yourself from providing guidance. Even stuff that you believe is useful in a lot of cases, it might both not be useful in all of the cases and might be abused, but also every word you add to the guidance is another word that could be misconstrued, that could be misunderstood.
Yeah, that tension I find particularly challenging are between giving enough detail that people can pick it up and run with it, but not writing so much that it becomes prescriptive and every single detail feels locked in. And then, of course, we're translated to a global audience. I think the majority of the articles are in what, 5, 7 languages now? And every reader, not to mention every new language full of readers, has a different lens and a different cultural basis they'll use to interpret these things. So where does that get us? Where is the journey of contextualization?
I think it has. I think there's an inherent conflict between the desire to scale something like SAFE and the challenge of contextualization. And I don't know what's the answer around that, but it's the fine line that we need to walk.
I think for me, an aspect on that is the opportunity we have with these streams where we have a longer format. You know, we had a fun chat when I got on a soapbox in one of our Saturday sessions a couple of weeks ago and rabbited on for 10 minutes. And then Rebecca chimes in and goes, okay, you've just taken 10 minutes to describe one sentence on one framework article. So we have the longer form and we have the opportunity to both expand and contextualize thinking, but also reinforce the context in which you might do that. So it's nice to have the space where we're not limited to 2,000 words that have to be translated into 7 languages. But to throw back to another Saturday session conversation of, you know, Sahil suggesting that we needed our slogan to be "Here be dragons." Because when we go hyper-contextualized, you know, there's danger in applying anything highly contextual if people are only listening to the outtake as opposed to listening to the preceding conversation that said, in these circumstances.
Here there be dragons is definitely something to keep coming back to. So maybe that's a good transition to another topic is, what are those dragons? Like we touched on them a little bit, but what are the biggest dragons, the biggest anti-patterns that you see when people try to read it by the book? And I remember last time we did have a long conversation around detailed stories and a couple other ones. So maybe are there new dragons to talk about this week?
I mean, I would actually. I think that's a dragon that we didn't slay, to be honest. We were going around the bushes around that, but we didn't really enter the cave of what's going on there. So I'm game to focus on that. Because I think it relates to the topic of agility. For me, the question is not, you know, PI planning, did we go too deep into stories, yes or no? So the question is, so what? What's the issue? And one of the main challenges I see where people misinterpret PI planning is where they go and they think it's about the plan rather than about alignment. When they think they need to understand each and every detail, the work breakdown structure, so that they minimize surprises along the way. So they have a perfect aligned plan and they can provide solid predictability to, or even perfect predictability to the organization. And my problem with that is that the impact might be that it would be hard to welcome changes along the way because you have a plan that you fall in love with.
So,
And for me, the reason there's a dragon there is because if we start to say, wait, you don't need necessarily all of that, there's the risk that you won't think enough about things. That the magic of collaboration and discussing, what's potentially going to happen is not going to emerge.
So I'm kind of curious, because I think part of the, let's say the joy of SAFE is not everybody trying to implement SAFE gets a Yuval or an Eric or a Stephan coaching them through setting it up. But all of us here teach SPCs. And if you think about setting that context of PI planning, the various constructs of PI planning, and how you prime people to avoid the dangers, what are those kind of key thoughts that you drop in when you're saying, hey, this is how PI planning works, to really set the scene for them in terms of being hyper aware of those risks?
Is this one that might be useful? Is this one that might be useful to kind of run through the agenda and maybe talk section by section? What we run into, or is this better as a broad?
Have we got the agenda on the Miro somewhere? If not, I'll go and madly find it.
I think it's mainly the team breakouts, right? Where we fall into this trap. Team breakout.
May I challenge this? Yuval? It starts with the business context, right? Setting the scene. If I think about the word frame and framework, how do you frame a PI planning, setting that stage? And for me, the business ownership, leadership has an important role, supported by change agents, by SPCs, that we don't fall into certain traps. For me, the team breakout is already too late to react if setting the stage is misused. Like, here's my presentation as a BO. These are the challenges, but there's no discussion. There's no, as David Marquette would say, give them intent and they give you back their intent. We do that on day 2. That's way too late for me. And that's one of my challenges in each PI planning. How do I kind of prepare a company, support the business context, which really sets the scene, and marvelous things can happen then, right? I don't want to fight symptoms. I want to go to the core of what is really the job to be done on a more canonical level, more on a structured level. But people already know what are we after during those 2 days.
I guess the reason I was jumping to breakouts, I see what you're saying. The reason I was jumping to breakouts is as I was running how we teach PI planning, and in the context sessions, we say the right things in the training, or we don't say the wrong things, I would say. There's, it would be interesting to look one by one if there are any smells in those sections of something that drives people to be too detailed and create the full plan. But my feeling is that that stuff is fine. But then we go into the details, the pictures even of how should the team planning board look like, and we even have that I think somewhere on the mural. I think it's the last frame, where we show a picture where you need to know everything that's going to happen in your PI, and that's the planning context. Teams need to build plans based on stories and capacity for everything in the PI. And then we go and do an exercise where this is what they focus on most of the time, is if they follow, the canonical guidance. I seem to remember when I took the class from Dean years ago that there was this view that not just in the roadmap, but also in the different iterations of the PI, there was less content as you go towards later iterations in the PI. There was more room for things to emerge, for more optionality. And maybe that's just my, something I made up. Maybe it's just the roadmap that looked that way and still looks that way. But that's how I want to portray the iterations.
So it's an interesting one for me, the way you described that, Yuval, because in the guidance in the article, it doesn't say anything about putting stories on the board. It only highlights significant dependencies that are required to complete features. But to
I'm
your
talking
point,
about the team board.
well, but to your
the
point,
program dependency board.
I understand, but to your point, the natural way in the exercise, though, pulls us to this habit of decomposing sufficient stories to figure that stuff out, but not as part of the program commitment, and not as part of the team's commitment, just as part of the figuring it out design elements. So I think there's a potential interesting dragon is where the tools that we give teams to use to figure out what they can commit to then become the commitment. And I think we've seen that in Scrum back since the beginnings of Scrum. It's like we go through a lot of different tools that we use to figure out what can the team safely commit to help the business deliver. And then all of that working notes, the show your work piece becomes the commitment rather than the actual commitment. I think that's, for me, been one of the biggest dragons I've run into across the board with PI planning is like, no, we're actually just going to commit to these objectives. We have some ideas of what our sprint goals are going to be to get us there. We did a lot of notes about how we intend to get there, but those are just notes. That's not part of our external commitment, except for when other teams rely on us.
Which I think, for me, ties back to Stephan's concept about the work you do before you enter the room and the context setting. Like, the most common danger I see when I look at PI plannings that aren't working, that I haven't been part of setting context for, it's people misinterpreting and going, the stories are the commitments, as opposed to the objectives of the commitments. And whether it's the way you contextualize it in the training room, whether it's the way you contextualize it in the pre-briefings with the business owners and the art leadership, whether it's the briefing sessions you give the Scrum Masters in terms of things to really keep in the back of their mind. And I like often in a physical room, one of the things I love to do when I debrief the exercise is to take a story and tear it up and go, imagine we're inside the PI and it's turned out this was a stupid idea. Well, if we're going to do something differently and we're not going to violate the control boundary of the objective, let's tear the story up and write the story we should have written at PI planning. There's something about tearing up a story that really triggers people to engage with the moment. I very much enjoy it as a bit of stagecraft.
I've been guilty of similar things, and I love people's faces when you do stuff like that. Or the company, I'm like, why don't you just unplug your defect tracking system? You just told me that 97% of the stuff in there you haven't looked at in over a year. Like, so do we want to go down the thread of what happens when things change more deeply, or do we want to focus on the nature of commitments a little more first, or are they intertwined?
I guess for me, the key question is, what's the minimum? What do we think amongst us is the minimum level of elaboration at the story level that we need in order to come up with commitments at the objective level? And if we're, while taking into account that this is very contextual, right? And with that in mind, do we feel like there's any additional recommendation we have for people that are looking at their PI planning, and tips for how to avoid this slippery slope of committing to your stories rather than your intended outcomes, your objectives.
I'm gonna maybe claim the right to go first on this one because I wrote the guidance article on objectives. So just as a line in the sand, the way I've taught it and the way I've put the guidance out to people when I'm talking to them is start with the end in mind. So our goal, in my mind, is to achieve maximum flow value during the PI against the most important outcomes that the business is pursuing. And I could keep adding words on there, but I think that's good enough for this conversation. To get there, at a team level, there's a handful of things I care deeply about. One is I would like to set an expectation with my business owners of what they can expect from my team. Two is I want to make sure that other teams can rely on my team on the things that they need from me in order to, or need from us in order to move forward with their commitments to the business owner. Third, in order to achieve both of those goals, I want to play through the work well enough that I've teased out the majority of the risks that I'm likely to experience. I'm not going to be perfect. The world might change around me, but I want to tease out enough of the risks so that A, I can deliver on my outcomes, and B, I can support the teams that need me to deliver on their outcomes. So is that a fair coverage of the space? So to accomplish the first goal, actually to accomplish both of the first two goals, I'm going to focus on the third one for a moment, of the playing it through. This is where I see most of estimation as a design activity. So what I look at is tell a team, take this feature, take this thing you think you need to accomplish, and make a list of what you think you need to do to get it done. And look at those things and have a conversation about each one as a team. I don't use story language here. I use the things you need to do language. And from there, I start to get to what I verbally describe as, and what these probably should be is kind of like your 8 and 13 point stories. They're big stories. And if you're pretty comfortable with what's in them, if from a fear, uncertainty, and doubt point of view, there's not too much in there, you're done. I wouldn't even touch those any further. Maybe they're just a title. Maybe they're not even in user story voice. But just toss them in there, and that gives you something to start to frame on the backlog. And I don't know if it can pull me to frame 10, that's a pretty useful view of the Miro.
Well, you lost your audio, Eric.
Yeah, I had to move Miro. Sorry. If you want to pull me to frame 10, it's a pretty useful view. Push to talk has limitations when you're trying to move Miro at the same time. So I take those 8 and 13 point stories, then the big stories, and that frankly is the capacity. So anyway, so 8 and 13 point stories, I can actually fill out this entire grid relatively quickly. Hour, and I have a decent coverage. And then I start to dig into the risk and say, for the ones where other teams need them, put a little more work in. Or where you have those outbound dependencies. For the things where you need work from other teams, put a little more work in, so that you can understand the nuance of that. That might be another hour and a half during PI planning, just of going deeper, unless you run into a big pile of uncertainty and you don't actually realize what the business feature is. In that case, congratulations, you caught that before you invested $1 million. Let's bring the business owner, bring the product manager, get those figured out where we just didn't understand the direction. And that's PI planning working as designed. And that's kind of the end of it for me when it comes to stories. If you have a decent understanding of roughly what you can get done, where the risk points are, and more importantly, if you understand who's dependent on it, and you've built the social relationships so you can navigate that in real time throughout the next month or two, then that's all the detail you need at a story level. So anyway, I'll stop there, but that's roughly how I teach the progression and think through the details of this and building out these boards. I'm curious where other people see it differently.
I see it as a great part. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Stephan.
go. Okay, I agree with you, Eric. I would even go a step further, right? Breakout session 1, if you think about the end result, it's alignment, transparency, and a set of committed PI objectives, not committed stories or a plan, right? Because the plan can change. Mike Tyson. You need a plan to start the fight, but it might evolve over the time. That also means on day 1, based on how you set the stage, I would like to have conversations, collaboration between the teams, the art roles, the business owners. Where are the skeletons in our cellars, right? Surface them, because that might then add it to a high-level estimate plan as you described, Eric. So what could impede us to come up with a set of committed PI objectives? Because objectives are good, but if I don't know where the impediments are, not only risks, but real impediments or organizational matters, stuff like that, you probably come up with a half-baked plan on day 2. It looks nice. It looks good. You have some alignment, some transparency, but it's probably not the real or the true story, right? That allows you then to use those high-level estimate items, whatever it is, stories or parts of features, to then progress and go into the PI execution. So what I miss quite often, although trying to teach that in Safer Team trainings, POPM trainings, Scrum Master trainings, surface those skeletons, because they are probably jeopardizing your plans.
You're going to add some stuff too? Yuval, you wanted to add some stuff?
Yeah, this makes total sense to me. I would love for this to make it into how we teach people by the book, I would say. I think there's a lot of stuff that is in the materials, not necessarily in the article. There's a bit in the article that we can look at later, but in the training that goes way beyond what you're describing, Eric. That I think is contextual, that you might need in environments where there's huge dependencies that you weren't able to unravel. The other question I have is, or the other thing I would add here, is when you look at the later iterations, do we want to encourage people to leave even more space, not to necessarily overload it, but just to look for that critical chain? So as I was hearing to you, there's one aspect of what can we promise our business. The other piece is, can we meet promises to other teams? What do we need from other teams? We might have stuff throughout our PI for both. How much space do we want to keep in our PI for things that we don't want to promise right now? Because, you know, if we've seen PI after PI that 30% of the PI content is changing, or if the business is telling us they want to change things along the way, should we do PI planning differently with an eye towards that? To make it easier to react to the plan of the battle rather than follow the plan. I mean, Mike Tyson, when he goes into battle, he doesn't have a script of exactly what he will do in each round, I hope.
Well,
He has some broad strokes, 8 points, 13 points approaches, but it's much easier for him to change the plan. I would hope.
Why can't we?
Yeah, and I guess I'm struggling a little bit hearing this because this sounds like Scrum Basics guidance just applied at the release train level. If you historically have a 30% churn rate, you probably want to make room for a 30% churn rate. And I don't feel like that's outside the rules. It's maybe not clearly documented, but that gets into the do we want more words, or do we want the simplest possible thing that sets the scaffolding? Because I could easily write 50,000 words on probably each lesson, each segment of the agenda, and still leave some things out. And nobody would ever read it and they wouldn't get anywhere with it.
Can we find less words that tell the right message? That's the question. Can we make it simpler while driving it in the right direction? Is the question. The guidance, I mean.
I think that for me, the guidance is clear. It's people's interpretation of the guidance that's the problem. Like if I take, a response probably just to add a little bit on that entire thread, and I'll start with where you started on the later iterations, Yuval. The first bit is Scrum Basics. Your backlog should be an iceberg, right? Big fuzzy stories in the later iterations. We've talked about icebergs for the best part of 20 years. The second piece is uncommitted objectives. The framework's very explicit that uncommitted objectives are in plan but not committed. And what I reinforce in the teaching is to go, all those uncommitted stories should be in your back iterations, because that's actually one of the ways that you're, setting up flexibility. There's no point having a story related to an uncommitted objective in sprint 1, because by the time you figure out you might need to flex, it's too late. So I look for, and I'll often actually add a color code to go, let's see big presence of uncommitted stories in the later iterations, because that's using uncommitted objectives to give me the flexibility that I need, because part of what's meant to happen is if I discover stuff that goes out, I can easily deal with it, because I start to just slide stories for uncommitted objectives out. We've preset the guardrail. But the other thing I think is, when I teach safer teams, and to be honest, I think one of the most brutal things that happens to trains with PI planning is if they don't do the safer teams Kickstarter to it, is we've got that nice long string of activities in safer teams where they split a feature to stories, they split stories to smaller stories, they estimate stories, they write acceptance criteria. And one of the things I always reinforce with that is to say, you get to the end of that first one of you split the feature to stories and you go, here's a question for you all. Do you understand more about your feature now than you did 10 minutes ago? And they'll go, oh, yeah. Right? And then you get them to do estimation. And they do the estimation. You say, and do you understand more about your stories now and your feature now than you did before you estimated? They go, oh, yeah. Right? Because the act of writing the story, the act of estimating the story, generated discussions that flushed assumptions and clarified interpretations of what was in the beginning of the feature or the concept or the idea, and they raised questions. And for me, the whole presence of story generation in power planning is actually just giving you a tool to explore the thing that you're working out to commit to at enough detail to have a reasonable understanding of it. And the seeds are all planted there. It's a question of whether we, in teaching it or coaching it or teaching those who teach it, plant those seeds of, don't interpret the guidance in a legacy way, interpret the guidance as it's intended. Because if you interpret it as it's intended, you avoid a lot of those traps. Yeah, particularly uncommitted objectives. It's amazing how many people go, uncommitted is, I couldn't fit it in the backlog, but, we're going to sign up to it anyway because some stakeholder wants to see it on an objective list.
It's interesting to me, Mark, because you get into a dynamic that I've observed a number of times based on what people's previous Agile experience is. And in some way, the ones that misinterpret this part of SAFe the most are the ones who have large company, long-term Scrum experience. The ones who have been trapped in a mechanical implementation of team level agility for so long that that's the only lens they have for the scaled team agility and the multi-team agility. An interesting one is like people with no Agile experience, especially those coming from backgrounds outside technology, they drop right into the SAFe guidance and they don't demonstrate any of the anti-patterns. I mean, they have a different set around technical cleanliness and other things like that that perhaps needs some work. But people coming from non-technical, non-Agile backgrounds who also weren't traditional project managers don't tend to exhibit any of these dynamics. The other really good one, and this one's the one that I always appreciate and I don't see enough of anymore, is people coming from an old school engineering project management background, where the almost that generative project manager who was the technical maestro project manager, pulling it all together, not just the administrative project manager. And those individuals actually have a remarkably powerful interpretation of SAFe as well. So it's like, what lens are people coming from? And frankly, I don't know how to write for that. That's one I've struggled with in my own writing, much less framework writing. But that where is your, I don't like the word mindset, but where are you coming from has a huge impact on how people interpret this segment.
But listening to you, Eric, fully agreed. Again, it's about how do you guide people through that 2-day process, right? There's so many ways how to do it. And when we talk about teams having already had Scrum experience, they tend to locally optimize. And now we are in a setup where we globally optimize towards a solution or a cluster of solution based on the Agile release train or the development value stream. And that needs different guidance regarding, again, what will be the outcome that then kind of fosters and supports outcome. In the process, we are deconstructing or decomposing features into smaller chunks. It's still about output. And in teaching, I always try to bring them back and say, guys, why do you deliver that output? Because in your PI objectives, you will tell us what you deliver and what it will create as a base or as a direct outcome if it's delivered, right? But that will be measured way later. But still, in our process over those 2 days, we should be outcome focused, not output focused. We talked about this trap now, right? Too much output, too much detail, too many details. It doesn't help. And as Mark said, what if 2/3 of our PI objectives are uncommitted, right? There's a lot of spikes in there. There's a lot of exploration in there. I can't promise that we will deliver because we are on a learning path. That should be considered as well. And these discussions, most of the time, in my experience, although we try to teach it, we try to coach it, it doesn't happen on day 1 and day 2. And also, the discussion between business owners and the teams is about, oh, we have to assign on a scale from 1 to 10, what is the business relevance or the strategic relevance? That's okay, but it has different time boxes that we have to bring into a context that the teams understand why they create that output. That is really then, fostering and supporting outcome.
So you kind of, I think we all agree, but I think you will go ahead.
Yeah, I think we all agree. And I think that's part of the issue, that we all agree on what's going on here. We all agree that You just take good, solid, agile or agility practices and you apply them at scale and you end up at the right thing. But like we've seen at the team level agile, we're seeing that our guidance is so hard to get right. If you need, people like us teaching this versus the average good SPC teaching the class and what sort of PI planning intent and understanding people get based on that, then that's an issue, right? If you look at, one thing we could do is take a look at the guidance and what does the article, not too much text there, but does it take people in the right direction or is it hard to vague? You could interpret it this way, you could interpret it that way. And some days I'm thinking, would it just be better to say we don't even give guidance to go into stories? We really focus on the objectives, and if people say, I don't know what objectives I can come up with, we tell them, okay, so break it down to the things you need to do and build, understand what you need in order to do these things. That's the sort of tweak I'm toying with.
I'm going to pop open my 10-year-old drawing here because I think it's particularly relevant. If you have a train that doesn't have a high degree of need to work together, then I think that would actually probably be just fine because the teams would figure it out. But what that doesn't do for me is solve the second of the three goals, which is how do I help other teams rely on me and to know when I can rely on other teams. And frankly, if you don't have any dependencies on other teams, I'm not sure if you need to be a release train. That might just be an administrative convenience train, not a unified release train.
My assumption is that they would be dependencies.
So if there's dependencies, I think it is on us to provide meaningful guidance on how to decompose sufficiently to navigate those dependencies and identify where they are and what they look like and what do I actually need, and make sure that the engineer on team 4 knows the engineer on team 6 that's going to write the API that they're going to call. And I find that's where the decomposition is a design activity, because we don't have a master architecture. We don't have a script that says here's where every single relationship needs to be going into the next 3 months of typing we're going to do. It's a discovery process that the teams need to do in an environment where they have other teams around to interact and collaborate in the process of figuring out what those relationships between services look like.
I'm 100% with you. What I'm saying is, just for argument's sake, if that thing that they do doesn't look like the same language of the thing that they do during iterations. You said I don't call it stories. Great. Let's not call it stories. Let's not even use the same artifacts. Let's do something that's clearly a sandbox activity. That's clearly a design and exploration, innovation game, whatever. That by design, we end it with, we go in and tear it all up. We don't take any of it to our real work, or just the key pieces that are on the critical chain, the key points that we need from each other. Would that set up the right mindset for people? That's the question I'm toying with.
So I think there's a trade-off with people's emotional attachments and perceptions of waste. But it's like, I think if we run the thread of the last 10 minutes, it's no easier to avoid zombie safe than it was to avoid zombie scrum, right? That was definitely one of the threads.
Except we have more.
And if people consistently misinterpret the fact that your backlog is something that you should manage and refine and not treat as a commitment, then I don't know that the answer is to go, don't use a backlog. Because I think the risk might just shift towards, we walk out of the room with a whole bunch of things that aren't a backlog, and then we make a backlog, and then we zombie the backlog that we make after the room, because it's going to be much more polished the second time we make it. For me, there's a certain forcing function that says, because you are generating a lot of it in a PI planning, what you're doing is, by nature, you're going, actually, this has to be something that's malleable, because it is lightweight, light touch, low fidelity, right? Where you get a team that perhaps, one of my biggest hates is teams that bring in Jira or Azure DevOps into the room in PI planning, they start loading it there. At that point, boy, your risk goes up. But again, I come back to, what's the contexting? When I brief Scrum Masters, when I'm coaching at PI planning, my brief to Scrum Masters is, I've got all your stakeholders trapped tonight. Your goal today is to flush your backlog enough to let me do good work for you with your stakeholders tonight. And when you're picking your level of your stories, the detail of your discussions, the nature of your discussions, right? Use the story generation as a way to trigger you through a process of discussion about the things that are going to be important and the things that might bring you undone. And set me up to really get your stakeholders to work for you tonight with the problems and challenges you uncover today. Right? And if you can build that mindset, great stuff happens.
And this is where,
Kind of like what we say in the RT, right? Just enough preparation to enable collaboration. I think that's exactly what you're talking about, Rich.
so if we believe that is the guidance, I mean, it's in the courseware, it's the intent is that we have just enough preparation. Maybe channeling our values as a community a little bit, how do we put things out there that make it more likely people are going to engage the way Mark does? What are some of the things we could create? What is the guidance that needs to be written? What would we put out there to make it more likely that we'll get less mechanical outputs from PI planning and more social and intent-based, outcome-based, collaborative outputs?
So as I was listening to you, Mark, talking about the backlog, something clicked. So in Scrum, let's talk about Scrum level for a second. When we do iteration planning or sprint planning, we build a sprint backlog. We're not talking about the product backlog. When we're doing refinement, we're working on the product backlog. We're not talking about the iteration backlog. When we're doing PI planning, what we're doing in SAFe is we're working on iteration backlogs for multiple iterations. We're not really working on the team backlog. It's somewhere in between. We're asked to put things into iterations. We're not just refining the backlog. But I think, to Eric's point, what could we do? I think if we reposition, if we start to talk about PI planning as a big room refinement session, where what we actually do is we're refining team backlogs in light of the interaction between teams. We're refining the art backlog, the integrated backlog for the arts. And we have some notions about the forecast of what's going to happen with that backlog over the next PI, but we're not binding it yet. We're using it to flush out dependencies like people do in backlog refinement, not just in big room planning. I think that might help, especially people in the Agile community, understand better what's the intent with PI planning.
I think you have just nailed Eric's comment about people from long-term Scrum environments and their common misinterpretation. As I listen to you speak and your separation between sprint backlog and product backlog, and your translation of sprint backlog towards iteration backlogs. Through the kind of, let's use Scrum language for a moment, product backlog. I think of the team backlog as the product backlog. But in my mental wiring, PI planning, the backlog you're generating is your product backlog. It ain't a set of sprint backlogs. You have a prioritized product backlog, but you've roughly prioritized it by prioritizing it into iterations as opposed to a story-by-story sequence.
Yeah, and I just popped the picture up for you, Mark. That's explicitly what's in the Safe Scrum article. Is stories from PI planning go into your team backlog, which would be your team product backlog in Safe language or in Scrum language, and then you iteration plan it down to your iteration backlogs. And I would, so this is where maybe there's a misconception, is what you described, Yuval, is what I do during PI planning. Is you're filling the team's backlogs, and nowhere, and this is an interesting one because I had to go double check myself on this one. Nowhere in the framework text that I can find, and I could be missing something here, does it persist those iteration buckets after PI planning, other than for the dependency support on the program board.
You might want to take a look at Frame 8. I went through the PI planning guidance article and highlighted some things that, for me at least, could be understood to say exactly that. Like, teams create their iteration plans. That sounds to me like they're creating iteration backlogs for different iterations.
And this is in the
PI planning article. Yep. Draft plans, iteration by iteration. Pre-populated iteration backlog for the upcoming PI.
So that is a great, and as soon as Eric started talking, I went looking at that frame because I remembered your call out of it, Yuval. And it sounds like we might have found a place. I went straight to where this frame, as soon as this conversation started on the thread, I went, oh, I remember seeing some interesting looking words Yuval had stuck in. Because these words tell a different story to the picture. And it probably tells me it's been a while since I read this article carefully. Because that you can easily see how that maybe for a long-term scrummy, particularly a zombie scrummy, you can easily see how these words would head you down the wrong path.
Or a classic project management work breakdown structure person, or I would argue there are few people that would interpret it the way we are.
Well, so now I'm wondering, what we have just perhaps done is identified the opportunity to name a framework defect. Because there is an inconsistency between the Safe Scrum article and the PI planning article now. Cool. That's an opportunity to improve things. Let's figure out how to write that up and share it.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you rewrote the one that you have on the Miro as teams leave the PI planning event with a forecast of their iteration backlog or some language more like that, then maybe we can soften it and reduce the risk if people read too much into that one word of pre-populated, which is entirely legitimate. It's a strong word. Because I think of it as a sketch. Like, it's a sketch of where I think things might land, but I'm going to go execute and do Scrum now.
It just, and kind of, it's where I think the interesting thing about you being a PST as well as a safe guy, Yuval, is the separation between those terms is so strong in your head. But that's like, oh, okay, so anybody who's really deep in Scrum has that big separation. In my head, the iteration backlog is the stories that got prioritized out of the team backlog, and they're sitting at pretty similar granularities because I refined them and split them in the team backlog. So for me, it's really just like a time box window into my overall backlog. But it's obvious that if you're deep in Scrum, it's a very different thing in your head. That's a fascinating insight. There we go. We got a nice concrete outcome from this morning.
With the hope of maybe going to another one, what do you think about looking again at the frame with the team breakout view, frame 10, I think, and saying something along the lines of what we say when we teach the roadmap slide? You write the font on iteration 2, 3, and 4 is a lighter font. It says forecast. It says refined. That it's clear that all of this is written in the air. It's not set in stone. It's how do we take this visual and bring assume variability preserve options into it? That's my question.
Yeah, I guess my perspective on that depends on which mechanism is safer, less dangerous for teams to use. So we have a mechanism to do exactly what you described. That is what uncommitted objectives are intended to provide. But to your point, it's not visual. It doesn't leave capacity for things to flow into. And perhaps especially in incredibly dependency-heavy trains, where it's like a tangle of spaghetti trying to plan a story, then the idea of replanning partway through in removing stuff and then adding stuff might be too painful. And in those contexts, I probably would leave more capacity and expect 80% of the stuff in iterations 1 and 2 to flow forward, especially if they're very hopeful for the benefits of agility, but they haven't tackled any of their architectural challenges. But on the other hand, if you have a healthy culture that understands and respects the intent of uncommitted objectives, then there isn't a particular need that I see for what you're describing. And that might be company by company what's more valuable or what's more healthy for the teams.
But now it becomes really contextual, as we mentioned before. Do you have more percentage of innovation work where you don't know what you don't know? How do you plan? How do you decompose? Or do you leave some more slack because it's exploration time? Or is it more features derived from the life cycle where we know what we do? There are little gaps. They exactly can tell you what they do. But let me tie it back again to leadership and business owners. You can misuse the PI planning by stipulating the teams, guys, I need facts and figures. Can you deliver? And for me, the big issue is we as an art, when it comes to software, we shouldn't become the software factory. It's a bunch of people together with an alignment, creating transparency. How much exploration do you need? And then probably the team breakouts would look much different than if I do a lot of life cycle features, stories, stuff. I know what I do. It's really dependent on where I am with my journey regarding the different solutions we have on the art level.
This is an area, and there's been a couple of these in this conversation where we're at risk of following the pig and chicken pattern. And by that I mean we don't know how to help heal a cultural situation, so we make rules to avoid it and dodge it. Because like there are solutions for the experimental, very unpredictable space. Mine is I put experiments in the backlog or in my as my objectives, and then I don't worry about it. And if people understand their experiments and they're named as experiments, then cool. My objective is to run 5 experiments in this product space, this PI. Very easy to validate and very easy to target, and people understand the value you're pursuing. Meets all the checkboxes. But I would be very hesitant to add additional rules and regulations and structure and prescriptions to SAFe as countermeasures to things that are solved if we can do the cultural changes that come along with deploying a healthy, safe implementation.
One thought that comes to mind as a way to maybe walk that fine line is, what if when we're talking about PI execution, when we're talking about, let's say, the conversations around system demo, we do a scenario, a case study, where the business owner comes and needs something that, is not in the current PI plan, is not anywhere even in our uncommitted objectives. It comes up in the system demo. What do we do with that? And the conversation, the exercise should hopefully probe that space around, okay, what do we do with this? Let's WestJF it versus the other things. Do we even want to go there, or just stick to our plans? We don't automatically do what the business owner came up with. But if there's value here, how does it affect our PI plans? Can we change PI plans? What does that look like? And, maybe a conversation and the debrief of that exercise could be around, okay, is there something that made it harder for us or increased the cost of welcoming this change in the way we did PI planning? Is there something we want to do differently, and kind of get people to really understand the principles behind PI planning and the intent, and driving the point that it's not about the plans for these iteration backlogs. It's about understanding, getting some alignment. We don't want to do it every iteration because the coordination cost is crazy. But sometimes, things would shift and we would need to waste some time to redo some planning that for some stuff that we thought we would plan ahead of time.
I think for me, there's a challenge there, which is how much do you teach in terms of all of the scenarios? Like, if you think about a safe course, right? If it goes on a slide, if it goes in the structure, it's going to get taught every time. And the
All right, everybody, and we're back. I apologize for the technical difficulties of the internet disappearing out from under me. Luckily, I think we were at a pretty good wrapping point for the topics. As Mark pointed out, as we were reconnecting and stating what we were going to do to restart. We spent a good hour 15 deep diving all of the challenges around PI objectives versus stories and the risks and various anti-patterns that come up around those. So we'll parse this out, get it recorded or dropped onto YouTube, because that's a pretty good artifact of the ways things can go wrong and the ways you can navigate and the words you can use to help fix it. Let's look forward to next week. Mark, what do you want to tee up?
So Yuval, when he started this series off, said, why don't we look at through the lens of principles? And I could see he'd done a little bit of thinking, and it was sitting in the back of my head. And I went yesterday, what an interesting exercise it would be to just go through deliberately every safe principle and examine PI planning through the lens of that principle. And I found it to be a fascinating and provocative exercise. And I would really love for us to take that journey together. And back to that comment of how can you make PI planning what it's meant to be instead of what it could be if things go wrong. I actually found the principle lens was brilliant for providing some framing around that.
Great, so we have something to look forward to. I think we have a little bit of homework to do to prepare for that discussion, so I look actually quite a bit forward to doing that homework. And with that, any closing thoughts you want to share? Let's start with Stephan.
Yeah, so one thought is, one of the last nuggets for me in this conversation was the interaction between PI planning and PI execution. and how you could look at things that happen in PI execution and reflect back to where we're following the safe principles in PI planning. And let's think about how do we keep on using that interaction between PI planning and execution in the next stream.
Similar thoughts, Yuval. If you think about the target of a 2-day PI planning, and even if you then open up your horizon, not only one PI, it might be a series of PIs that leads to an overall target, and then working your way back through the agenda is really helpful for me, and has helped me in the past as well to being a better facilitator. But I'm still learning. And thanks, guys, for the insights today. Really valuable.
Mark?
What have I got to say? It was worth waking up early for. Reset my time zone clock from working late, talk to the Americans when they wake up, to starting early and talking to the Americans as they go to sleep. What do you know?
I just think the planet's a circular sphere or something like that. I think for me, I love the connection back to the principles, because it is a continuous flow in a circle. Like most of my sketches that I draw of how SAFE works are circular in nature, because it's kind of back to the old stacked rings view. You got the daily cycle, the 2-week cycle, and the midterm cycle, whether that's 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever. And just remembering the role of this planning event in that cycle, and how it needs to feed and nourish the inner cycle while accomplishing the goals of the outer cycle, it is one that I bring to a lot of my thinking here. And a lot of the misconceptions, I think, are when you forget the objectives of the planning event. So just having, and I haven't taken the time to step back and distill kind of those 3 main outcomes of understand and set expectations with your business, set expectations with other teams, and create the social network that can deliver against those expectations. That's my distillation of PI planning. Sometimes I forget there's a bunch of other rules and prescriptions that people have built up around it. So with that, anybody listening, thank you very much. We look forward to next week's session, and we'll get that on the schedule here in the next little bit. And with that, have a lovely day wherever you happen to be.